Welcome back to The Right Angle, the podcast for fantasy readers, writers, and anyone who loves a good story. Hi, I'm Autumn.
And I'm Adrienne. In this episode, we're diving into the modern-day female protagonist trademark symbol. We're asking the questions, where did this trend of hyper-independent, strong, battle-ready female main characters start? Why did this archetype get so popular? And what are some of the traits of these characters? And then we'll examine some of our favorite and least favorite fantasy females.
So what do we mean when we say the modern-day female protagonist? In modern-day fantasy, nowadays, there is this concept of a female main protagonist. And it is oftentimes now considered kind of a trope surrounding this character. And it is basically a series of character traits that a lot of readers feel that female protagonists written nowadays share and often find a little bit annoying.
I personally have seen a lot of skits about them on TikTok recently of either female characters written by men or just every female main character in fantasy books. We're going to talk more in depth about the traits that they all seem to share, but a couple of examples include being hyper feminine while also being very strong and demanding, being super powerful but somehow not knowing their own power, and other things kind of like this.
And a note to clarify is that we're not saying this is bad, but we're not saying it's good. We're just saying that this is something that has become, as I said previously, a common trope amongst female protagonists. And it is a bit of a trend that we see increasing still. And like most trends, you have people who lean really heavy into it, and you have people who are trying to flip it on its head, and people even doing the complete opposite. So today in this episode, we're going to explore a lot about what the female main protagonist is. So where did this female protagonist originate?
I had a theory that it really started with the dystopians of the 2000s. So what I mean by that is Twilight, which came out in 2005, The Hunger Games, which came out in 2008, and then Divergent, which came out in 2011. They all feature female leads, and they are very strong-willed adventurers in a way, and I think a lot of books tried to model their success after that.
This trope is generally hated by a lot of people, so why do so many readers and writers dislike the modern day female protagonist?
I think at its core, it's not the fact that they are female main characters. Obviously, I love that there's so many amazing, strong female main characters that little girls like us reading fiction in high school and middle school and elementary even can look up to. What hurts so much is when the characters misrepresent what a woman can really be. They're portrayed either as these objects, they have unattainable standards, or they're just plain stupid, when real women are strong and tender, have strengths and flaws. We are very complex, and I hate when a female main character is written so flat and like she's not even a person.
For me, I agree a lot with Adrienne's points. It's very much a common trend for these women to be flat, for women in general to be misrepresented, and that's something that has been a constant throughout history, and to see it still happening today is such a tragedy, because there's this joke that when men write female characters, they're not usually well written, but we see now, but the female main character trope and its downfall is not just something that happens with male writers. I see it with female writers too. So you can't just say it is a gender thing, that male writers are just bad at writing women. It is an everyone problem. Another addition that added on to this already developing trope was this idea in the early 2000s of adorkable characters. So your characters who are a bit quirky, a bit silly, a little bit clumsy. Very much your character that is a little weirdo, but in a lovable way. And I feel like this really started out in a lot of your Disney teen movies of the time period. An example I think of is High School Musical. You have Gabriella, who is this little bit of a nerd, a little bit of a social outcast, but has some quirky traits that make her more lovable. And that was a common theme for Disney movies of that era. And that really, I think, started seeping into our young adult literature. And that's just one side of what a lot of female protagonists nowadays are trying to incorporate. The other side is this almost hyper strong character, which that comes from a lot of Hollywood movies misrepresenting and misinterpreting the feminist movement, where women wanted to be seen as stronger, and so movies started portraying them as such. Rather than having your very passive housewife, you have your ultra strong girl boss. And they basically went from one end of the spectrum to the complete opposite, where what we really need is to find some middle ground, some balance, because as Adrienne said, women are very complex. People are very complex. And just showing them as being one thing is so unrealistic, and it just misrepresents people. And so examples of this in movies are a lot of Marvel movies. You have female characters who are really, really strong, very girl boss, very much baddies. And some examples, and I'm not saying that all of these female characters are poorly written, because some of them are very well written, but they are very much on this other side of women. And I'm not saying that these characters are poorly written, because a lot of times female characters have their moments where even if overall you know that it's not a great representation, they have their moments where they are very well written. And I think that is the case with most female Marvel characters. Is overall, are they representative of all women? No, because that's basically impossible. Are they representative of some women? Yes, theoretically. But to put in perspective, they are in a superhero world where it isn't like reality. It's not meant to be exactly like reality. So we can give them a little bit of grace.
And to be fair, the women that we're talking about that are these hyper strong independent females are Gamora, Black Widow, Captain Marvel, and Yelena. But Marvel actually does have some more realistic women. What I think of is Pepper Potts. I think she's pretty realistic in terms of the Marvel universe.
She's one of those characters that hits a very good balance between being a strong female character, but that's not her only trait. She has softness to her. She has depth, where some of these other characters are only strong, they're only tough, and that's the only thing about them.
I think especially with Captain Marvel, her movie did kind of touch on her background a little bit, but I still never got the feeling that she was vulnerable, ever. And we're going to talk more about this specific trait, but she's so overpowered instantly when she finds her powers or whatever. It's just so unrealistic. That's just bad fiction writing, not bad female main character writing.
And another thing I think we should note is that sometimes you have characters that are written as this stereotypical strong female protagonist, and it works. And it's very much situational. It's very dependent on the setting and the story that they're in, because sometimes I'll be reading books where I know this main character. I've read her in another book. I know exactly what she's going to do because the traits that they've incorporated are so overused. And yet I'm still reading and I'm still enjoying it because it works for the book that I'm reading. It doesn't work in every case, which is why we're talking about it, is because it is so situational.
So then if this trope and this idea of the modern day female protagonist is so hated, why is it so popular? Why are people still writing and reading these books? If you think about it, a lot, if not the majority, of fantasy fiction readers are women, at least where Autumn and I are from. And so, obviously, we're going to want to read about female main characters too, not just male main characters. So it makes sense that everyone and their mom is going to try and write a strong female main character that we can relate to.
And oftentimes, when a writer is writing a character, I can speak to my own experience, we often pull characteristics from ourselves, from other people, from other writing. And a lot of times that amalgamation forms very similar characters. You can love them, you can hate them, but it's almost a universal experience that when you're writing a character, there's always going to be a little piece of yourself in that character. And so I know a lot of characters written who are avid book readers. And that's because so many writers love to read. That's how we got into writing, is because we read so much. And so part of the reason I think we enjoy these characters so much is because we see a piece of ourself in them. We see that little bit of awkwardness, we see the clumsiness, but we also desperately, I think a lot of us when we're reading, want to feel strong. We want to be that more strong female character who doesn't let her emotions take control, who doesn't get hurt all the time, which is why I think we see this misalignment in the modern day female character of she is soft, she is girly, but she's also really, really strong, is because us as readers, we are more soft a lot of times. We are emotional, but we want to be strong. And I think that is where the disconnect comes from. And I think that's why it's you either love this character or you hate her.
I think similar to that, wanting to see yourself in the story and relate to the main character, part of it is that a lot of people read romantasy to escape into this world. I think part of the rise of the popularity of this strong and often desirable female characters is because of the lonely women who are reading these stories. They want to feel desired and loved just as much as anyone else, and they want to put themselves in the place of these female characters who often have a lot of love interests or are super powerful and beautiful and all of these wonderful, gorgeous things. I think that's also what led to the rise of popularity of smut, which is a whole other can of worms that we're not going to talk about today, but I digress.
I think it's very much that some of these characters, while they're flawed a lot of times, they're still very perfect in a sense. They are oftentimes very beautiful, very smart, very clever, very charming, etc., etc., etc. And so many of the readers, for a multitude of different reasons, want to feel that way too. And so, as you said, they do envision themselves in place of that main character. They do put themselves in that spot where they can be those things themselves.
I think that's very true. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, Autumn and I are a little bit biased against modern day female protagonists, but I will admit that she does have a time and a place, and there's a reason why she's so popular.
Oh, 100%. I know times in my life where I've enjoyed the modern day female protagonist more because of whatever I was going through in life, because I needed that sort of escape, because I wanted to be her in a sense. And so I find myself a little bit sympathetic towards this trope. And while now as a writer, I find it very painful, as a reader, I understand.
For sure. So now we're going to kind of transition and examine some specific traits that this modern day female protagonist has, either good or bad, when it fails or when it succeeds.
And this is not an absolute list. And a very important thing to point out is not every modern day female protagonist within this trope that we're talking about possesses every single one of these, because we have a very long list, but it is just more so a list of things that we commonly see in these types of characters.
So the first trait we thought of is when these characters are so overly feminine to the point where it feels like it's a mockery of femininity. It seems like when people write a character like this, they are trying so hard to portray that the fact that this character is feminine that they go overboard. They do all the stereotypical things like she loves pink, she likes to wear bows, she likes flouncy dresses, she bakes and cooks and cleans, and all of these things when it adds nothing to the character. It's just like adding traits to make her interesting while also only using stereotypes. It's a very strange character trait.
I feel like another very common trait for these type of characters is being overly sexualized by the characters within the story, but also by the fan base outside of it, which fan bases over-sexualizing characters is not something new. It's never going away. And so that is not necessarily what we mean when we say over-sexualized. It's a part of it, but it is more so within the story itself. And a good example of this is Black Widow. If you look at the types of costumes she wears, they are very tight fitting. And they're not done that way because it's effective in combat. They're doing that because they're trying to over-sexualize that character.
Another example I thought of that doesn't necessarily wear sexualized costumes is Padme Amidala in the Star Wars movies. I actually think it adds something to her character because she's such a politically smart woman, but it's very telling that the fan base of Star Wars really only sees her as this beautiful object. I think that's very interesting. The next trait we thought of was this character degrades their own power or downplays it while at the same time being insanely overpowered for no reason. Personally, I feel like the main character, Aelin, in the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas is very overpowered. And she doesn't necessarily downplay it. She's a very strong person. But from what I remembered, it just seemed like she had this insane, crazy power for no reason, and it happened all of a sudden. That's how I interpreted it, at least. I know that Autumn disagrees with me, actually.
I very much disagree with that, but I think that brings up an interesting point that we can talk about, is that you, the audience, can disagree with us on these characteristics, on the characters that we're giving as examples. That's completely fine because it is how we interpret the characters. It's how we see them. And it's not a black or white situation. It is very much a lot of gray. And so while I might disagree that Aelin isn't as overpowered as Adrienne's making her out to be, but that's my opinion, which I'm entitled to have because that's how I interpret the books. But Adrienne's allowed to have her own, and if she believes Aelin's overpowered, that's completely fine because that's how she interprets the books. Another character trait that I think we see a lot of times is that the book itself does not pass the Bechdel test. So what is the Bechdel test? Basically, it is this idea that a female within a book needs to have more than one female friend, and they can't only talk about the men in the book or the love interests in the book. If a book has more than two female friends for the female main character and they don't only discuss men, then the book passes. If it doesn't, and there's like no friends for the female character and she's only interacting with men, or she's only talking to her one female friend about all of the guys in the book, then it doesn't pass. But nowadays, the idea of the Bechdel test has kind of shifted a little bit to be more, is the story centered around a man? And a note about that is if a female main character has the character trait of, oh, I hate men, that can still make the book male-centered. It really depends on how the author goes about it. For example, if the female main character is like, I hate men, until she meets this one guy and then immediately falls in love and is like, oh, men aren't that bad, that's still male-centered. Versus if it's a I hate men kind of book. And so the female main character falls in love with a woman. That's not male-centered because there's not really a male in that situation.
Something kind of similar to that, not necessarily about men, but when the character is so very strong in the beginning, like not wanting a relationship or anything, and then as soon as one male character is introduced, they immediately fold under zero pressure and are suddenly okay with, being in a relationship and not wanting to be as independent. That seems a little bit unrealistic when their whole goal in the beginning was wanting to be independent. Another sort of trope that we were talking about is the glow up. This happens in movies like The Princess Diaries or She's All That, when the female main character is seen as either lower than everyone else or not as pretty, and then as soon as they, take her glasses off, she's gorgeous. And it's not necessarily that they see that she's beautiful underneath her glasses or whatever. It's more that they see her potential. So it can be good or bad depending on if you do it well.
I think The Princess Diaries handles this very well because of the main character, and she isn't this traditional female main character, but they do put her in a setting where a lot of traditional female main characters are put. And I think she surpasses that, where a lot of others fail in the sense of like, I'm only beautiful because I've gotten a makeover versus I'm beautiful regardless.
Yes, and I really love that they took that character, and even after the glow up, she still failed miserably at so many things. Because it's a comedy, and I think they handled that really well. They didn't make her perfect at being a princess right away. Like, she had to struggle through that even after getting the glow up.
And I think a good segue from that is this idea of the perfect woman or being very cookie cutter. So a woman who doesn't have really any flaws throughout the book, or the flaws that she does have are kind of dumb. They're often shallow and they don't really add anything to the story. They're usually added on so the character doesn't seem perfect. But in trying to make the character not seem perfect by adding these shallow flaws, it makes the flaws that you do add have less meaning, and it just kind of crosses a bunch of wires, and it just ends up not working well.
It's kind of like when you go into a job interview and they ask you what your greatest weakness is and you say, I work too hard. Like, that's not a real flaw. That's just so you can get the job. That's kind of what these really shallow flaws feel like. Another trait we thought of was the idea of the pick-me. I actually went to the Urban Dictionary because I don't even know how to describe the phenomenon of a pick-me, but Urban Dictionary describes it as a person who begs for the attention, acceptance, and approval of a certain group in different things they say. In most cases, it's to attain the attention, acceptance, and approval of the opposite sex. This has been a huge joke on the internet for years now, but this often happens in female main characters when they are just so bent on having attention from the opposite sex that it, again, becomes male-centered. Another part of this pick-me persona is that often the females are almost too masculine to the point where it feels like they're just putting on a show of it instead of that's who they genuinely are.
Kind of like this idea that she's one of the guys or she's acting more masculine to gain the attention of the guys, to be seen at their level, which in theory isn't bad. But a lot of times the way characters go about doing this are bad.
You almost get the sense that they're trying to reject their femininity, and that really hurts a lot of women who are secure in their femininity.
And something kind of, in my opinion, in a similar vein to the pick-me type characteristic is this I'm not like other girls character trait, which has also become a bit of a joke online, where it's girls purposely trying to act out, seek attention by being different from the norm. So a lot of times these characters embrace this quirkiness to themselves, but they kind of overdo it. Like we talked about before with the adorkable characters, it's very much that same vein of acting. And I think A really good example of this is Rapunzel from Disney's Tangled, who is a quirky character. I wouldn't say she fully embraces the I'm not like other girls, but she is very quirky and she's very unique and she embraces that, and that's a big part of her personality.
I think why Rapunzel works specifically is because she was never around other girls, so she obviously doesn't know what it means to be normal and therefore can't try and break outside the bounds of normal. So that's why I really love her in this trope specifically.
And in my opinion, an example of a quirky character who isn't as great, don't get me wrong, I still think she's a very fun character, but I think Disney doesn't handle this trait within her as well, is Anna from Frozen. She's very quirky, she's very clumsy, she's very lovable, but not in the same way, but in a way that I found to be a little bit more annoying than Rapunzel, because I fell in love with Rapunzel. Anna, I find a little bit annoying, but that might just be a me preference thing.
I think it is because I disagree. I think it's totally okay to have that opinion. I think that Anna was one of the launch pads for this adorkable character trademark. And I think a lot of characters tried to copy her. So now that we're all so tired of it, we go back to Anna and we're like, oh, she's the same way, but I think she started the trend. So I think she's really well written, and not to say that you don't think she's well written, but I do think that she is a good example just as much as Rapunzel is, because she was also isolated from a very young age and was alone all the time. So I think it makes sense that she's like that. I think she's almost supposed to be annoying. I think Disney did that on purpose. Again, in a similar vein, another one of these tropes that is very heavily talked about online is the manic pixie dream girls. These are also characters who are just free spirits and not like other girls, and they have names like Rain Willow Spoon or whatever. I think this really started from John Green's female characters. I think some of his are written really well, and I think some of them aren't as much. The book that I think of is Looking for Alaska, with the main character, Alaska. She's kind of a manic pixie dream girl, and that one really bothered me. I found her so annoying. They are so intent on being unique that they forget that they're just people. This trope is very hard to describe, but it is a very specific and identifiable one when you come across it.
Another trait that I commonly see in these types of characters is being overly naive. So someone who, I think they're trying to capture the fact that they're very innocent and aren't as knowledgeable about the world, and so they're easily fooled and tricked or misunderstand things that are happening around them.
I think on the other side of that coin, I think it can almost be wanting to portray women as stupid when they're trying to do that. It's either one. It can either have good intents or bad intents, but it often comes across as too much unless you do it well.
And I think we see a lot of Disney princesses this way. So many of them are incredibly naive, and it always works. In a Disney movie, when the main character is naive, I think of like Ariel in The Little Mermaid. It works very well for the story because Ariel grew up in the ocean under the sea. She doesn't understand the customs of the human world. She doesn't understand how everything works, but they don't make her stupid. Ariel is not a dumb character. She's just naive. And she's also young. She is 16, I'm pretty sure, in this movie. And so it makes sense for her to have a limited worldview because she hasn't seen much of the world at this point. Very much like Rapunzel and Anna, both of those characters are also very naive, and because they're isolated, because they haven't experienced much of the world, but it doesn't detract from their characters. Disney does a good job of showcasing that, yes, they're naive, but they're not stupid, they're not dumb. While I think a lot of times there are a lot of female main characters nowadays who are naive in a way that is detrimental to the character. They are kind of portraying them, as Adrienne said, as dumb and stupid and in a negative and harmful light.
Autumn and I were just talking about this earlier before we were recording today, that Disney is weirdly really good at writing strong and realistic women. I think we kind of forget that they are the OGs of this concept. If you think about all of their princesses, they are all fairly realistic. They have flaws and they have weaknesses, but they also have strengths. And one that I see heavily debated online is Cinderella. They say that, well, she's not a very strong woman, like she had to have other people help her. When you really look at the story, girl was abused pretty much her whole life and did not see a way out until she was helped by the kindness of someone else because of the kindness within her. So I would argue that she's a very realistic character because she was able to accept help and then find her strength after she was helped out of a horrible situation.
I think a lot of the negative responses to Disney princesses are because of a misunderstanding, a misinterpretation of the characters themselves, because a lot of times you have to look at the situation the character is in within the story, because Disney does a very good job of the character traits they give their female characters based on the situations that they are currently living in. But you also have to look at the time frame in which these stories were created as well. In our modern lens, yes, there are some things that are problematic about older Disney princesses. But in the time when they were written, that was normal. That was fine. Like when Cinderella was written, it was written in the 1950s. The world looked a lot different then. They treated women a lot different back then versus now, where we are striving so much for equality. And well, I'm not saying that back then the women didn't deserve it and that like the stories being told about the women deserved to have the women looked down upon. That's not at all what I'm saying. But I think there is a lot of benefit to be gained from looking at these stories in the context in which they were written to understand and appreciate them more.
Another trait that we felt could go either way is the trait of being emotionally unavailable. I think this one's pretty hard to do well because they almost use this as the only plot device to cause conflict. Me personally, I hate the miscommunication trope. Kill it with fire. But when emotionally unavailable characters are done well, it's very good. A character that we thought of was America from the Selection series. I think she somewhat toes the line. She's very emotionally unavailable, but has reasons for all of it, and that causes a miscommunication in the story. But I think this one is one that does pretty well with it and creates a great story. I love the Selection series. I think it's great, so.
To kind of build off of what you were saying there, another trait that oftentimes I think is one of the main issues with the female main protagonist is them not having any agency. So agency is that internal motivation that drives a character. It's their purpose for doing things, and it can come internally and it can come externally, but you have to have both. To have a well-written female main character, you have to have that internal drive, that want to do something in the story to help move the plot along, while there is external things happening that move it in a way that maybe the character didn't want to happen, but are forcing the character to. And a lot of times, I think, with these female main characters, what's missing is that internal agency, that internal drive to do things, because they're just sitting around and they're waiting for other people in their story to act for them before they act. And I see this a lot of times with the male main protagonist, is he is the reason she is doing something. Before he came along, she really didn't have a direction or anything going in her life, which kind of centers back to that male-centric story.
The last trait that we have already mentioned a little bit is when the main character faces no hardship, or even when they do face conflict, everything just immediately goes their way. We sometimes describe this as having too much plot armor. Or another example is when the main character learns a new skill and then they are immediately great at it and are masters of their craft, which is not very realistic. One that I think of for this is Captain Marvel. The movie really just felt flat because she was succeeding at everything she did right away, and personally, I didn't love it, but I digress.
As an author, I understand why writers do this because it's easy. It is easy to have everything going right for your story because that's less you have to write and less you have to think about. It's really easy when a character picks up a sword, they take one lesson and they're instantly good at it. So you don't have to spend so much time doing a training montage, essentially. But that takes away from the story. That takes away a potential conflict you can have. I know for me, in my own story, I'm purposely not letting my main character ever be good at fighting. She knows how to throw a punch, but it's very poor technique. And that's because she never had the opportunity to learn, and it's unrealistic for her to know and to be instantly good at something. While there is a level of natural talent that in real life a lot of people possess, it's not something that I think is applicable in every single story. You have to see a character struggle to do something. It's like learning how to ride a bike. You don't get it right on your first try. You struggle and you fall down and then you get back up again. And that's something I think we need to incorporate more. That's what our female main characters are missing.
So now that we've looked at some of these traits that a lot of these female main characters tend to possess, we're going to examine a few examples from some not so great female main characters and some really good ones, and some in the middle. An example for me personally of a bad female protagonist is Juliet from the Shatter Me series. I have a violent hatred for this series. I made it about 3 books into it and had to quit. When we were coming up with our list for traits, this character is the one I kept going back to. She seems to have all of the horrible ones. She's very male-centered, she's immediately overpowered, but somehow this perfect, beautiful, powerful being. Every part about it, I hated it, and I will never try to pick it up again, but that's just my opinion.
To lean on the little bit more of a sympathetic side, I definitely think there are some aspects of this character that are a little bit cliche, that are a little bit annoying, but if you enjoy this character and you enjoy this book series, go ahead. Like, just because, while it might not be our favorite, we are not diminishing the book at all. We are not trying to stop anyone from ever reading it, because if it's something that gets you reading and picking up books and enjoying them, go ahead. Who am I to stop you? Who are we to stop you?
For sure. And again, like we said earlier, these books have a time and a place. Sometimes you need a book like this to get you back into it. I know I've only started recently reading again because of just some really, really bad romance books that I just need for brain candy.
An example of that is in the middle ground, purely because me and Adrienne couldn't agree on it, is a lot of the characters from A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. I'm of the opinion that they are middle ground, so I think that they have some very, very good characteristics within them, but they have some that aren't as strong, so I would put it on the higher end of the middle, since this is very much a spectrum. But I know Adrienne doesn't feel that way.
I don't. I do feel that these characters do have some very redeemable qualities, and I did enjoy the story when I read it. I know I'm pretty heavily biased against this series because it used to be, at least, marketed towards adolescents. Not necessarily Sarah J. Maas's fault, but again, we're not here to talk about that today. I do think the characters are fairly well written, but I do see them as somewhat male-centered, and they have a lot of tropes in those books that I'm not a fan of, and they seem a little overpowered to me. But again, I did really enjoy the story. I don't hate these books by any means.
Well, for me, I do agree that these characters are a little male-centered, but I think it's very much circumstantial, and the circumstances in which they exist in, I think, help make it almost an exception of, yes, they have these character traits, but this is a situation where I think it works. It doesn't work all the time, which is why they're in the middle, but I think it works enough of the time. And I think, like Adrienne said, this is very much for me one of my book candies of something that I just genuinely really enjoy. And so that's probably coloring my view as well.
Yeah, that's totally valid. All right, now moving on to a couple of examples of our really good female protagonists. I put a poll up on Instagram earlier today, and I asked people, what are some of your favorite female characters? And one of them that I 100% agree with is Evangeline from Once Upon a Broken Heart. This series is very good, and this main character is so realistic to me. Evangeline is a very soft-hearted woman, and I love that she stays soft-hearted the entire time. It's kind of one of her flaws, that she just cares so deeply at the expense of herself often. I just love the way she's written, and that she's not expected to suddenly become this ultra tough, strong warrior, and she's allowed to stay soft-hearted the whole time.
On the flip side of that, if we're looking at more of the strong side of female main characters, I think a show that has multiple really, really good examples is Netflix's Arcane. There are, 4 or 5 main female characters who are all very strong in different ways and are just incredibly, incredibly well written, well thought out, and just work so well for the story and the environments they're in.
That show is just brilliant in general. The way they write women, the way they write men, the way they write the entire story and everything is so well done that you almost don't see these female main characters as female main characters, trademark symbol. They're just people. Everyone in this story are just people trying to do better, and I love that.
I think one character that really stands out from this series is a character called Mel. Mel is a very beautiful woman, and it would have been very, very easy to over-sexualize her. But I feel like Arcane does a good job of balancing that. She is pretty, but that's not all she is. She's incredibly smart and cunning and very much a political figure during this story, and she makes those moves not because she's pretty and because she's making moves on all of the characters to try and seduce them into getting what she wants. That's not at all what's happening. What she's doing is she's using her cunning and her intellect to be smart about everything that's happening, to make bargains with other political figures in this story, because she's more than just a pretty face.
I think one of the only criticisms I've seen of her character is that in the second season, her storyline was super rushed. So it did feel a little bit more flat, but I don't think that's necessarily the producer's fault. I think Netflix only gave them 2 seasons and they should have gotten another one, but whatever. But they are coming out with a new show that's all about where Mel's from, so I'm really excited to get more of her backstory specifically.
And I think what they do so well with Mel's character is that I think everyone would agree that she is a strong female character, but she's not your traditional strong female main character like what we've been talking about with all of these other character traits. She's not unemotional. She doesn't hate men. She's not like super duper muscular, but she is strong in a way that I don't know if I can quite verbalize. Adrienne, how do you describe her?
I think she's just realistic, and the audience can identify with her even though she is like a beautiful woman and she's so strong, but she's so easy to sympathize with and see part of yourself in her anyway. She's not too perfect. She's not unattainable. She's just who she is, and I think it's because she's comfortable in her femininity.
She is one of those who strikes, I would say, the perfect balance between that feminine side and that strong side that I think a lot of the female main characters today struggle so much with, of you have to be both or you have to be all one and not the other, where it really is, I think, a percentage, and it shifts a little bit too, because I think there are scenes with Mel where she is softer, but you still see how she has that strength. Her being soft doesn't diminish the strong side of her, and her being strong doesn't diminish the feminine side. they find this really, really good balance of both.
Well, Autumn and I could talk forever about just truly great female main characters, and we could also talk a long time about really poorly written characters. But this episode was just to give you a taste and to spark your thinking about this topic that is so highly debated in the fantasy world. Thank you all so much for listening. That's it from the Right Angle, where we know the real magic of books is for everyone. Readers, writers, and all those in between.
Until next time, write boldly, read unapologetically, and stay weird.